Okay. All right, welcome back, everybody. It's Friday afternoon, and we are with General and Housing, and we are here this afternoon to hear from, to continue our kind of introductions from stakeholders who are involved in housing throughout the state of Vermont. And we are here today with Angela Zakowski from the Vermont Landlords Association, and she will explain what the organization does, and how she fits into, how the organization fits into our work. Angela, before we start with you, we have our committee is completely different than last year. Let's just say that. So whilst you may know some of these folks from different places within the State House if you met them, but basically our committee is new. And so what we're doing is learning the vocabulary, the lay of the land, not so much into direct policy work. We have 0 bills on our wall right now. So this is just a general overview and introduction, because we know we'll be seeing you again and perhaps again throughout the biennium. So Representative Tom Stevens from Waterbury.
Representative Kathleen James, Manchester.
Representative Saudia Lamont, Lamoille, Washington.
Representative Emily Krasnow, South Burlington.
Rep. Ashley Bartley, Fairfax in Georgia.
Caleb Elder, Starksboro.
Dennis LaBounty, Lindenville.
Elizabeth Burrows, West Windsor.
Larry Labor, Essex Orleans.
Robin Chestnut Tangerman, Rutland Bennington.
And Representative Mary Howard, who is a returnee, is here as well as the ranking member, and Representative Joe Parsons, who's a returnee, is not here today. So welcome.
Okay. Thank you very much, Chair Stevens, for having me. I see a few familiar faces around the table, and Representative Elder, you are one of my representatives as a resident of Moncton, so I'll just throw that out there. My name's Angela Zakowski. I am the director of the Vermont Landlords Association. We are a statewide trade organization for landlords. So what we view our role as is providing education, support, and information for landlords. We want them to be doing their work and their job correctly, following the rules, making sure they are providing safe housing for their residents. And so we are the place where they can come to get that information. And along with that, we provide information to the legislature. We sometimes present bills. You may hear from me on different housing bills from the landlord's perspective. And what's a little bit unique about my situation is that I'm also a practicing attorney. And I have a full-time legal practice representing landlords. So not only do I see sort of the practical side of the landlord-tenant relationship, but I also work on the other side. So when the relationship has disintegrated, or when there are problems, or when a matter hits the court, I'm very familiar with that process, how that process and procedure works, and sort of the impediments and issues that both sides are running into with evictions in Vermont and a broken relationship. So I will say one of the highlights for my organization is during the COVID times, I think as we're calling them, in 2020, we did put together and launch a landlord-tenant mediation program. We've continued to receive funding to run that program through June of 2025. And so this is a way for landlords and tenants to try to resolve disputes, whether there's a pending court case or whether there is not yet a court case. And the program funds and pays for a professional mediator for the parties to try to get together and resolve differences, save housing, have repair or open lines of communication. Many times evictions or landlord-tenant problems are simply the parties can't communicate with each other anymore. And so it's broken communication. So that program has been piloted and it's currently running. So if you have constituents that come to you that are landlords or tenants that are having an issue, that would be a great program to refer them to. I'm happy to send out materials for the committee to have for your own use, or to have if constituents reach out to you. I think we're facing sort of an unprecedented time in housing right now. We have a very low inventory, and there's a number of reasons for that. And I'm, hoping we see some work on sort of the development side so we get more units online. I think that will alleviate part of the problems that we're seeing is that we just don't have enough units. We don't have enough rental units. We don't have enough regular housing units. And as Chair Stevens knows, my approach to most things is balance. I'm looking for things that are balanced. There's give and take on both sides. Nothing is perfect. But if you take too much from one side or the other, it creates problems and then the system doesn't work the way it's supposed to. So always willing to have conversations with legislators or the other side if we're discussing or talking about a situation. Generally, there's a reasonable path through that. It's just we all have to find it, and sometimes we have to be creative about it. So I know you gave me 45 minutes, or that was what was docketed, and I know I'm a lawyer, but that doesn't mean that I have to stand up here and be a talking head. I'm happy to answer questions, or if there's something else you'd like me to address specifically, happy to do that.
I think some Q&A, and I have a couple of leading questions that I can softball over to you as well, but Representative Burrows.
Thank you. As a lawyer who represents landlords, how often do you go to court where the tenant also has legal representation?
I would say currently it's a much higher amount. So with much higher occurrence. I know Vermont Legal Aid has received some grants and is providing more representation than they have in the past. Legal Services Vermont has more attorneys working for it and is able to provide more representation to folks, even if it's just behind the scenes, walking them through process, providing forms to them. There's also a number of legal clinics that run around the state, specifically related to the rent escrow process in an eviction, where volunteer lawyers come in and provide representation for that day. So I would say compared to pre-COVID, I see a much higher rate of representation from the tenant side than before. But it's hard to compare because I know there's also a lot of landlords that handle these cases pro se as well. So while there's the sense that all landlords have attorneys and tenants are unrepresented, I'd say that's not always the case, and we're definitely seeing a shift. I'm seeing many more represented tenants in these cases than I have previously in prior years.
Well, that was going to be my second question. But so right now, forget about pre-COVID, but right now, would you say it's half? I really just don't have any sense. That's why I'm asking.
Yeah, I think it depends on what you consider them being represented, because there's a wide range. There are cases that I have where the tenant is completely represented, meaning the lawyer has entered an appearance. They are appearing for court hearings. That's the person I'm interacting with. I have an equally high number of cases where the tenant is talking to a lawyer. That lawyer doesn't actually enter an appearance in the case, but they are providing legal support behind the scenes. And that's the piece that is hard to catalog, because sometimes I know the lawyer that's working with them, and sometimes I just know because I see the forms that come in and I know that they've been talking to legal counsel just based on what they're filing with the court. But if you're going on just a pure number, like does a lawyer enter an appearance and is involved on sort of the day-to-day management of a case, that number is maybe a quarter of my cases. But I'd say using both of those scenarios, I'm probably at 75 to 80%. with represented tenants if you consider those folks that are receiving that behind the scenes help as represented.
And what about landlords?
I mean, I can only speak for the folks that I'm representing, so all of my clients are 100% represented because I'm involved. I know there are pockets around the state. Bennington County has a pretty high number of self-represented landlords. Rutland County has a pretty high number of self-represented landlords. And I can see that information, but when I look at the court schedule for the county for a given day, you can look down the list of cases. When they have a rent escrow day, you know all of those cases are landlord tenant. And so in some counties, I would say it's probably, based on what I'm seeing for court hearings, 50 to 60% of landlords are not represented. But in some counties, Chittenden, Washington, I tend to see a much higher landlords have attorneys in those counties for whatever reason.
Thank you.
Representative Chestnut Tangerman.
Thank you for being with us this afternoon. Not in your practice, but in the Landlords Association, can you give me an idea of the range of landlords? You know, when I hear Landlords Association, I think of somebody with a big apartment block.
Yep.
Is that accurate, or are we talking about owner-occupied homes with it?
I've got everything over there. We cover all the counties in the state of Vermont. We have everything from the very large landlords who have 100 or more units to the person who rents out a room in their house and everything in between. So we don't have requirements that you have to have a certain number of units. We even have some libraries and at one point, a couple police departments that were members because they found the information valuable and they wanted to be able to make it available to members in their community. So we don't even actually have a requirement that you have to be a landlord to join the association. Just have to want the information and be willing to learn and have access to what we offer. So.
Representative LaBounty.
Do you find the complaints more coming from the landlord side or from the tenant side?
Complaints about what?
Well, whatever the issue might be. I mean, is it more about the landlord saying that, you know, this renter isn't paying the rent and I've been trying to get it? Or is it about the tenant saying, I'm trying to get things fixed in my house, like the heat, you know, heating system or water or whatever?
So I think it's a tricky question. I think it's a challenging question and it can be hard to answer. So what I see a lot in my practice is landlord hasn't received rent. So they send a termination notice and then a case is filed for the rent not being paid. And then we hear, well, I'm not paying because. And so, you know, perhaps the issue's been going on for a while. Maybe the landlord knows about it. Many times the landlord hasn't heard about it. So that's the first time they've heard that there's an issue. I don't doubt for a second that there are problems that landlords are not addressing, even if they know about it, right? I think we can all acknowledge that there are what I would refer to as bad actors on both sides here. There are landlords that don't fix things. There are landlords that don't do things correctly. There are tenants that destroy properties, that don't pay the rent, that don't follow the rules. So we have that on both sides. What I can tell you is in the last year, I believe there were about 1,400 evictions filed. And prior to COVID, our average was about 1,800 evictions a year being filed. So if our number of rental units estimate is correct, which is about 76,000 rental units, we're talking about a relatively small subset of a problem from both sides, really.
And that we heard that from Legal Aid yesterday as well. And I want to throw a softball to you just to go back in time a little bit. We talked a bit about in 2019 the eviction, the report called Evictions, which really brought forth the idea that for $2,000 on average, we can resolve most of these rent arrearage issues. But could you just talk a little bit? I just want to, the stereotype, of course, is that we all know is that in these minority of cases that the minority of cases that are the angriest and the meanest and the hardest, the most damage, the most money involved, they kind of create the stereotype of the difficulties in relationships. But can you go back in time just to where you worked with Vermont Legal Aid and talk about the creation of that report? Because it really, for me and for our committee at the time, it was really a breakthrough in terms of the two sides having coming to the table to discuss the understanding and discussing the problem. And I just want to get your feedback on that report, because it fed directly into what had to happen through the COVID emergency.
Right, absolutely, and I don't want to take any credit where credit's not due. So that was entirely a legal aid report that was issued and work that they had done to gather the data. But it does appear that many evictions could be solved and are related to a tenant's inability to pay rent for whatever reason. It could be they are renting a place that they can't afford. It could be that they had a costly vehicle repair that just put their finances out of whack for a month. It could be lots of things. Missed work. I had a 2-hour delay this morning due to the weather. For somebody that works an hourly job, that can have catastrophic effects on them and their income. And it is sort of a domino effect that you see. So I think one of the things that report clearly showed is that there is some value in having an emergency rental assistance program that can fund some of these situations. And I think that we have seen that through COVID and all of the federal money that has come in with the different versions of the rental assistance programs that we've had over starting in 2020 and running through current times, that a lot of the evictions and a lot of the issues can be solved with some rental assistance and helping tenants get out from that financial hole that they can get dug into and get dug into pretty quickly. A missed rent payment or two can snowball pretty fast and can add up pretty quickly if rent's not getting paid every month. So I think there is, and I believe Vermont, I don't want to speak out of turn, but I believe Vermont State Housing Authority is getting ready to launch a risk mitigation or risk management program for landlords that can address some of these issues. But, in terms of just numbers, the cost to cure an eviction based on all of our data and the cost to house folks in emergency housing are sort of astronomically different. I think it's double to house somebody in emergency housing what the average cost would be to cure an eviction for non-payment of rent. And so just, dollars to dollars, I think there is some value there in the state considering some sort of permanent eviction rent cure system program, right?
And just for the committee's perspective or information. So in 2020, the first slug of money, the coronavirus relief funds, the CARES Act, was actually really the most string-free money that had ever been given out in the history of, or at least in recent history. So the programs that were developed, again, achieved the fairness that Angela was talking about, at least for money, because you could apply as a landlord, you could apply as a tenant, and there was obviously a need to confirm the relationship, but the landlords had an opportunity to get into the system, and when they did, they were getting back rent paid for. So when Vermont Legal Aid was talking about the drop in particular evictions yesterday, landlords were getting back rent for up to 18 months or more, depending on, there was a few cases where they were getting 18 months of back rent, which talk about snowball. And it could have been a month, could have just been, what we expect. So the second and third slugs of money, however, had strings attached that made it much more difficult for landlords to participate in the program, and it really fractured kind of the bonhomie that was happening, that we were able to keep people in their apartments or their units a lot longer than we could have expected. The moratorium was in place, so people couldn't be evicted for any reason whatsoever. But again, that first slug of money was really beneficial, where the landlord association helped us usher through the first moratorium, because they knew they had an opportunity to get paid. From that, eventually we ended up with, and so the difficulties of landlords accessing money, and we'll have a conversation with the State Housing Authority next week. But it did lead to this mediation program, and I don't want to even though the subscription rate may not be as high as we'd like to see, the fact is that it's there. And, the emotions of conflict when it comes to money and it comes to homes is still run so high. We had landlords who didn't want to participate in the BRAP program, even though, even when tenants asked them, and the same thing happened where tenants didn't want to get involved. So it's this real interesting balance. At times it feels like a tightrope, but I just want to say that the process to where we are today is, we had a blush of time where it seemed like the problems were being solved in the way that we would always like them to be solved, which is fairly string free. And then it became difficult again. So that's just us doing our job. I'm sorry. Yeah.
Oh, I was going to say exactly. And to further the point, I think the differences between the two programs. So the first program that was funded with CARES money was a Vermont created program. So it was Vermont advocates and folks running the program coming together to create this incredibly fair program that worked for both landlords and tenants, and sort of worked the way, here in Vermont, we felt that it should. The second program has been a federally driven and federally mandated program with how it's run and how it's structured. And so it's created some challenges because it hasn't always worked as well as I think all of us were used to with the program that we designed when we didn't have all those strings attached. So,
Representative Elder?
Yeah, Angela, I was just curious, of your clients, do you have a sense of how many of them would just own a single rental property? Is that something you keep track of? I'm just curious what the mix of the type of landlords you represent, like, are they landlords with 100 properties? Are they sometimes landlords with one property? Is there a way to characterize it?
I mean, I don't keep track of that for my own personal clients. I do know I have a mix, but it's not something that's data that I collect in that regard. But I do know on the association side, we have members that have all different types of properties.
Is that James?
Thanks, Chair Stevens. I had a couple questions about the mediation program, I'm new to the committee, so that's a new program to me. I wondered, Chair Stevens alluded to this a few minutes ago, so maybe I got my answer. I wondered if demand exceeded your ability to help landlords and tenants who come to you for mediation. And I also wondered what happens if a case goes beyond the $3,000 grant limit, who pays?
So I'll answer the second question first. So we haven't had any cases that have gone beyond the $3,000 grant limit. That may be partially because our mediators are very, very aware of that limit. And so I think at least one instance, I saw an invoice that would have exceeded and it was reduced to the $3,000. So I think part of it's due to an awareness by the mediators that they're capped at that amount. A substantial majority of them don't even approach that amount. So the 3,000 is a maximum that we'll pay. Most of the mediation that have come through have been in the $800 to $1,200 range in terms of what we're paying to the mediators for their work. And in terms of has demand outstripped or our funding, not yet. We were pretty close in 2020 when we first launched this program with our CARES money. That one was because it was a very new program and we launched it in a very short period of time. We did see sort of a real close call, but with the new funding under the ERA money, we haven't reached that level yet. I would love to be in that position, that we have so many mediations coming in that we're trying to figure out how we're going to fund them. But we're not there yet. And I think part of it's getting the word out, making sure people are aware of it, that it is an option. We're currently in the process of sending information out to all of the town clerks in the state of Vermont. That seems to be a place that lots of people go if they're having a problem, whether it's the health officer or just town clerks in general. So
I asked because, I'd love to start letting constituents know about this program, but not if you're oversubscribed and, they're going to reach out and hear like, oh, sorry, we can't help you out right now.
No, please refer them over. And as I mentioned, I have some information, RAT cards or other things that I can send down that have sort of the nuts and bolts of the program, where to go, how to apply, what the process is.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah. And just in comparison, we talked about $2,000 is an average of the back rent. This was through the eviction program. We're talking about $3,000 to pay for a mediation program, plus whatever the cost of back, obviously I'm not going to roll in back rent to that conversation. What is an average cost? I mean, this is a classic too early in the session question because everyone's individual, but what's an average cost of a court case?
Just between court costs and attorney's fees, not taking off the table if there's back rent or other things. I would say $1,500 to $2,500 for an average case. The filing fee just to file your case with the court is $310. Sheriff's fees are now $75 per person who needs to be served plus mileage. I've been seeing sheriff's fees running $200 to $300 per service if there's multiple tenants at a property. So that's a pretty significant expense these days. And then attorney's fees can run anywhere from $900,000 to $1,500, $2,000. Sort of depends on where the case goes and what sort of happens there. And those are for my fees. I know lots of other attorneys I think are more expensive than me. So that's, yes.
Yep, no, I just wanted to have the ballpark figures there. Representative Burr.
Where was it? What does ERA stand for?
ERA is the funding that the federal government gave as a round one and round two as a part of the COVID relief packages. And I am drawing a blank at what the actual words for that
Economic
are.
Recovery Act, I think.
There you go.
Thank you.
All of this, this is. I feel like our job has always been not to be the mediator. I mean, we are the lawmakers, so we are trying to find the balances between it. And I have appreciated the professionalism that both sides, between at least the advocates that are in the building, have undertaken over what is an exceedingly emotional issue for everybody involved. And I just want to clarify, make sure we all acknowledge that it's hard and we're going to disagree, or we're going to disagree with either the tenants advocates or the landlords advocates on how things have to get resolved, and it falls down to us to this is the only time I hope the session that I use the split the baby phrase, but it is definitely there are times where there is compromises can be as difficult as trying to get to one side or another, but I've appreciated the fact that we haven't generally within this building descended into difficult fights, personal fights that because that's what happens in court. That's what happens in these relationships between landlords and tenants when the relationship is disintegrated. So, and Angela and Legal Aid, the folks that we heard from yesterday, have been a huge part of that. Just sort of smoothing it out so that we can have the conversation about the topic at hand and about the statute at hand in a way that hopefully gets things done. Representative Howard.
Thank you. Hi, Angela. I have a constituent who has been renting a house for about 10 years. And the tenant is, like one of the best tenants you could have. And the landlord is the same, and they're trying to work this out. The landlord has asked them to move. She asked them way back in the fall. And the reason being is that their daughter is coming back and would like to live in that house. How much time can you allow before you take the next step?
Well, it depends on a lot of things, a couple of factors. It depends on whether or not there's a written lease between the parties. It also depends on how long the tenants lived there. So a notice in that circumstance could run anywhere from 30 days to 90 days. And it really depends on which of those factors come into play. So just maybe a little bit of background or information for folks that eviction process in Vermont is really what I call a two-step process. So step one is a landlord has to send a tenant a notice of termination. And there's a statute that lays out the various reasons that you can send those notices, non-payment of rent, some sort of breach of the lease, so tenants violating the lease, or a section that we have which is called no cause, which is the landlord doesn't have to give a reason, but they just have to comply with the timeframes that are in the statute. And so that notice goes out to the tenant, and if the tenant doesn't fix whatever is in the notice, so pay the rent or stop the behavior in a breach notice, or doesn't move from the property, the landlord enforces that notice with sort of step two, which is bringing the court eviction process against the tenant. And so that's the court is the only entity that has the ability to issue the paperwork to have somebody legally removed from a property. So both of those things have to happen before somebody can be involuntarily removed from real estate or from a rental property. So Representative Howard, it would depend on where she was in that process. Has she sent notice? Has she not sent notice yet? Has she started the court case? So there's a lot of variables there. And it seems like maybe it might be worth it for her to give the association a quick call and just ask some of those questions. They should probably be able to give her that information over the phone with a few questions to her.
Okay, I know that they have asked the tenants many, many times if they wanted to purchase the house, and they declined. So it's kind of a little tricky situation. They want to do the right thing, but
right.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Representative LaBonnie.
Have you ever had a landlord, or has there ever been a case where a landlord didn't have a contract with a tenant and then something happened and they try to get the tenant out? Or does that refer to some kind of Vermont law, or how does that work?
So I think it's the devil is always sort of in the details here. So it's going to depend on what the contract says, what the reason is that the landlord's asking the person to leave. There are sort of multiple tools for a landlord, types of notices for a landlord to use. So it's really going to just depend on what the lease says, what the circumstances are, what the issue is. And so if somebody has a lease and they would like their tenant to leave, if they're in the middle of a lease term, they may have to wait till the end of that lease term. If it's the lease term is over, there's some different rules that come into play. So I think it depends on on why and what the circumstances are and what the situation is.
Yeah, I mean, I know you just talked about, what type of lease they got. What if they don't have a physically signed contract or lease?
Yep. So Vermont recognizes verbal leases. And so there are different types of notices that a landlord could use. But yes, verbal leases are recognized in the state of Vermont.
Okay, thank you.
Are verbal leases considered month to month?
It's going to depend on how the tenant pays their rent. So you could, I suppose, have a weekly verbal lease if that's how the tenant's paying the rent. Traditionally, most of them, yes, are month to month type leases.
Do you does the Vermont Landlord Association deal with only long-term rentals?
Yes, we don't do any short-term rental work. There is the Short-Term Rental Alliance that has created that is sort of our sort of sister organization. They do a lot of the same things we do, but for folks who are doing Airbnbs and Verbos and sort of that short-term rental relationship.
Representative Eldridge?
What kind of protections would a month-to-month verbal lease afford that no lease would not? Because it sounds kind of worthless to me. I'm just going to be on, like, what's it for?
A written lease versus a verbal lease?
A month-to-month verbal lease. Why is that helpful?
I would not recommend that at all.
Right. I'm just wondering why Vermont has it. Why do we have it?
Because it's Vermont and we recognize all kinds of things here.
Okay,
Right. The tradition.
Yeah.
I think it's some level of acknowledgement that folks do business in different ways. And for lots of landlords and tenants, they don't feel they need something in writing and they're perfectly content to have that sort of handshake deal.
Understood. Yeah, no, I was just really trying to kind of ferret out whether when someone finds himself in an eviction proceeding, if having had a certifiable verbal lease afforded them any protection that they would otherwise have not had if the situation was deemed to be not under a lease at all. And what I'm hearing is not really.
No.
Yeah.
No, because the requirements in the statute are going to govern the relationship, whether there's a written lease or not. So there are sort of basic parameters laid out in our state statute in Title IX, Chapter 137, which is the Residential Rental Agreement Act. So that has a lot of rules about how this relationship's going to work. And even if you have a written lease, you can't do something that's going to run afoul of what those rules are in statute. So, we've done a pretty good job, or the legislature's done a pretty good job of laying out a lot of the key points of that relationship. So I think, some people may say, oh, well, it's already in statute. I don't need a lease because it's going to apply whether I have a written lease or not.
Thank you.
See, we can fill in 45 minutes. One of the, I think this is the last thing for me today, but Angela, one of the things, I think we had this conversation in pre-COVID. I remember we were in the room and I think we all came to the agreement that one of the hard parts with, and I've come back to it, say it's so emotional, right? Where we hear a lot about mom and pop landlords and the concept of mom and pop landlords is a very powerful political tool of we don't want to hurt people who are just trying to make ends meet or make their mortgages, whatever. Or we rent out our apartment at less than market value because we want to make sure people have, all these things that are wonderful if people can do them. But this is a business. And I remember we had this conversation of like, in the end, all emotion aside, if you take money for services, it's a business and there's a responsibility on the part of the landlord or the property owner to make sure that they understand that coming in, that there's no altruism per se. People may feel like they're offering less than a market rate is altruistic, and to a degree it is. I won't argue with that. But when something negative happens, we have to come back to the green books.
Right.
in order to resolve it. And I just think that's something that we hear more about it now in short-term rentals.
Right. And I don't think it's an either or. I think it can be both. I mean, I think you can be a mom and pop and still treat it as a business. The story and the scenario that I've been hearing more and more is the rental property owner who was husband and wife. Husband primarily managed the rental property, interacted with tenants, did a lot of work. Sometimes it's a duplex, sometimes it's not a duplex. Then husband passes away and the wife is left with trying to manage this property, manage the situation, maybe has the skills from the business angle, maybe doesn't. And in some situations has been completely terrorized by tenants or people coming to visit tenants. And so I think, that is part of this conversation, right? Because that is somebody who's providing housing who, due to just circumstances, maybe not has the skill set completely to do it in the way that it should be, or we all think that it should be, but that doesn't make it sort of less than or less considerations because the situation evolved in that fashion. And I think for me, when I'm talking about mom and pop, I do think they should be running it as a business, but I also do think that they have a lot more pressures on them than somebody who has a lot of units and can spread things across a lot of units. If you have, say, 4 units and you have a problem in one of your units, that's a 25% problem. If you have 100 units and you have a problem in one of your units, that's a 1% problem. In terms of your portfolio, your ability to manage cash flow, to take a hit. If you have 4 units and you have $10,000 in rent that you lose, that's a big financial hit for that landlord. And can be a situation that someone can't recover from, or creates issues where now they can't replace that roof or they can't replace that furnace because they don't have the funds to do it. So I think, I think it's both.
And it's also, like you said, big business too for for people who have 100, 200, 600 units, et cetera. It's still Vermont. We're not going to have somebody who has 115,000 units, but all right, any further questions for Angela today? I would like to just have us be done early. It's Friday, weather stinks, so, but I appreciate you taking the time to introduce yourself and what you do to us. And I'm sure we will see you again and again. So
fantastic. Thank you for having me in.
Great.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Hi to John.
I will.
Oh, he must be in college now, right?
No, she's.
Oh, okay.
Yeah,
She worked in our office.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, but your son is.
He's 11. He's a 6th grader now.
But he was 8 when he first became your co-star, so.
Yeah. Yeah, I occasionally have co-pilots with me, depending on where I am and what's going on. So, yeah.
All right, great. Thank you. Have a good weekend.
Thank you. Same to all of you.
Bye.
Same, Ron. We can go offline.